Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, whatever time zone you're in. Just welcome to Build 2020, and welcome to our session on how to modernize your applications using Windows containers. My name is Taylor Brown. I'm a principal program manager on the Windows Container team, and I get to lead a lot of our work on containerization within Microsoft. Throughout the session, you're going to be joined by Muzz. He's a member of my team. He's going to be doing a lot of our demos today. And is a great resource that we have. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Throughout the session today, you may hear some squeaky toys, or you might even get to see our little studio manager, Karen. If she makes an appearance, she's a lot of fun. Just be aware, she might make some noise. So I'd like to start things off with just a bit of evidence on why this is important. So over the past couple months, we've been working with a great customer, Woolies. They're an Australian supermarket and grocery store chain. And they've been on a journey to modernize some of their applications using Windows containers. And we've been working with them through private preview of the AKS service, which is now generally available in all regions. And as they were doing it, we were getting some great results, faster deployments, increased reliability. And this really turned out to benefit them greatly as the COVID crisis started. They needed to be able to increase their uptime and increase the load that they were able to handle on their website. 320% increase in traffic. And because of that faster deployment time and that increased reliability and less manual intervention, they were able to take advantage of that and deliver some great value to their customers. And so this is just one example of a customer who's taking advantage of this technology and really leveraging it to deliver digital transformation and business results. And so for the rest of the session, we're going to go over a couple of the ways that you can take advantage of this technology to set yourselves up for similar scenarios. So what do we mean when we talk about modernizing a Windows app? Well, we've got an existing application. And in a lot of cases, that application is working really just fine. It's doing the job that it was written to do, and it's working for us. But it's stuck in an older deployment pattern. It's stuck in an older way of operating it. Maybe it's stuck in an on-prem environment on an older version of the operating system. And really what we want to do is be able to take that application forward. And there's different sets of levels that we can take it forward into. We could rewrite the whole thing. We could just modernize it by putting it into a new deployment model, or we could start to rewrite pieces of it. And the pattern we're going to talk through here in a moment is actually a way where we can start to do any number of those. Right? So we simply can take our existing application, we can containerize it and push it into a container registry, like ones that we have in Azure, or hybrid or on-prem versions as well. We can hook that up to a CI/CD system. This can be as simple as just a set of scripts that do an automated deployment all the way through something that does full validation, stress testing, and load testing before each and every deployment. It's really going to be up to you. And then, of course, we can deploy that into an instance of Kubernetes. Now we can marry that together with databases and other parts of the application, all within the Azure environment, and all taking advantage of the cloud patterns that you've all been learning about throughout Build this year, right? So this is the pattern that we're going to talk through today. And to get us started with it, I'm going to throw it over to Muzz, and we're going to go through a demo of those first couple steps, getting that app into a container. All right, Muzz.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Taylor. The application we're going to demo today is called iBuy Spy. It was written with .NET Framework 2.0 on a three-tiered architecture using IIS as the front end and SQL Server as the back end. A quick fun fact about this application: it was written by Scott Guthrie when he was on .NET Framework team. The reason we chose this app is because it still represents a lot of applications being run in a lot of businesses and organizations around the world, serving critical needs. So today, we're going to modernize the deployment and infrastructure of this application using the latest frameworks and tools available to us. And to do that, the first step is to create a Docker file so we can create an image off of it. So think of Docker file basically as writing down all the steps required by your application to run. And that's basically your Docker file, just like your install script or setup script. right here, I have the Docker file for iBuySpy. And as you can see, I have all the PowerShell commands written down. For example, I'm running the ms build to compile the code for my iBuySpy. Now, once you have written a Docker file or two, it becomes very easy to write. But in some cases, we have seen that the teams responsible for writing the Docker file are not familiar with Docker or creating a Docker file. So today, we're going to make that process easy. Windows Admin Center is a tool used widely by Windows admins around the world to manage their server workloads. And today, we are very proud to announce this updated containers extension that you can use to write, which will write the Docker file for you and create an image. And to do that, we're going to come right here and select Create New. And if you see here, all we have to do is point it to the source code and define some basic things. For example, the .NET framework we're going to target. And as you can see right here, it just starts creating the Docker file for you. It will write it for you. And if you hit Build, it will create an image based on this Docker file. And I've already done that. So I have my iBuySpy image already created. Now I can run it locally to test it, or I can push it to Azure Container Registry, which in our case, we're going to do to consume it later. So to do that, if I hit push, all I have to do is specify my Azure subscription and the Azure Container Registry ID, and I can push it right from here to ACR. And that's how easy it is to create a Docker file and the image using this latest tool, which will be coming to you in the upcoming weeks. So with that, back to you, Taylor.
Thanks, Buzz. Yeah, I think it's really cool to see some of this Windows Admin Center tooling that's going to really help us enable both developers as well as DevOps engineers and IT engineers to take advantage of some of the containerization. Now, in a second here, our slide will reload back up. But in the interim, why don't we take a couple questions on what you just saw?
Cool. Thanks, Taylor. So one of the questions we're getting here is, with this WAC tooling that we just showed, is it possible to create all types of Windows application Docker files, and can I modify the Docker file once it's generated?
Yeah, a couple great questions. So we focused the tooling on a couple really common apps to start with, namely web applications. So we've got support for ASP.NET applications, either as solution files or as exported web deploy packages. And then really your feedback is going to help us guide on what are the next kind of applications to add support for. So expect to see a tail of existing and new types of applications being added over time. And then, yeah, the whole idea of this is that you can actually take that Docker file and do additional customization to it. So we may help you get all the way there, or the Docker file may be 90%, and then you can add the last 10% that's custom to your environment and your application. And it really kind of helps you build that Docker file and learn how to use it.
Cool. Thank you. Do we want to move to the next question, or?
Yeah, let's take one more.
OK. What Windows Server versions does the WAC tool support?
So with all of our containerization tooling, we're going to be targeting Windows Server 2019 and later. That's our latest long-term supported channel, and really what we're seeing people heavily adopt. It's also what's supported in the Azure Kubernetes service, and it's kind of the baseline for Kubernetes support. Of course, Windows Admin Center supports previous versions, but we're really going to focus this container tooling around 2019 and later versions.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah. So it looks like we're having a little bit of challenges with the slide, but that's OK. So what Muzz just demoed is he took that application from a container image, or from an application, containerized it, got a container image created, and got it pushed into the container registry. Now, if you remember back a slide or so ago, the next step of that was going to be to hook it up to CI/CD, and then ultimately deploy it into an instance of the Azure Kubernetes service. And Muzz has got a great demo that's going to take us into that next set of steps. So with that, why don't we just throw it back over to Muzz, and he'll take us through getting that app up into Azure and into the Azure Kubernetes service.
OK, now we have the image ready and pushed to ACR, the next thing we're going to do is create an AKS cluster. And you can do that using PowerShell or Bash or Azure CLI. In our case, we're going to use the Azure portal, and we'll select the Kubernetes service under the popular services right here in the Azure portal. And it has all the basic things that any Azure service is going to require: your resource group, your subscription ID. Now, I'm going to move over to node pools. And as you can see, AKS has already created the default node pool, which is on Linux. So I'm going to create another node pool for our Windows app, and I'm going to specify the OS as Windows so that my application can run on the Windows node pool. I can select the node size and the node count. And the next thing we're going to do is select the advanced networking option here under networking. And the reason for that is AKS today only supports Azure CNI for Windows applications. So once I've done these two things and I've filled out everything else, I'm going to quickly create a cluster by validating everything. To save time, I've already created a cluster. So if I come here and take a look, as you can see, I have a Kubernetes service right here and a VNet created for me. Now, just one thing to keep in mind, AKS is going to create another resource group for you, which is also called the node resource group. It will have all the plumbing for AKS behind the scenes. You don't need to do anything to it. Just be aware there's going to be another resource group. Now, if you see here, we also have the ACR, where we pushed the image earlier using this cool WAC tooling we just announced. And you also can see here the Azure SQL Server. And we have the server and the database. And I use the SQL Server data migration assistant tool created by the SQL team to literally migrate the whole existing SQL Server to Azure SQL in less than 10 minutes. And it's all very well documented, and we're going to provide links on how to do that. So now my database is created, and I already went ahead and in my web config pointed this database in the connection string. So now my database is connected. The next thing we have to do is connect the AKS with my ACR, so AKS can start. So the AKS can start pulling the images from the ACR. So to do that, let's quickly see how we can do that. So if I come here in the PowerShell, because I created my cluster using the portal, I'm going to get my credentials locally for my AKS, and then I'm going to log in to my ACR instance. Once I've done that, I'm going to run this command to update my AKS with attach ACR. What it does behind the scenes is it's going to assign my AKS service principal a role called ACR pull, which is required to pull the images from ACR. So once I've done that, my AKS is connected to ACR, and it's already was connected to the database. Now I'm ready to deploy my application. And to do that, I am going to quickly come here to my VS Code and look at the Kubernetes manifest file. It's a pretty standard YAML file. If you see here, I've defined it as replica this2 because, as I said earlier, it's a critical application. So we probably want to have some redundancy. The other thing I want you to look at is node affinity. The reason I've defined node affinity, and specifically the node selector, as Windows is because the Kubernetes master could try to schedule your Windows application on the Linux node. To avoid that, we're specifying that please deploy my Windows application on the Windows node. The other thing I have here is the load balancer. So I can get an external IP, and this is the Kubernetes load balancer, so I can access my application. So once I have this YAML file, I'm going to quickly go back over to PowerShell and deploy using kubectl apply. And this should deploy my iBuySpy to the AKS cluster I just created. Now let's go and take a look. So if I go kubectl get all, right here you can see, because I specified replicas as 2, I have 2 pods up and running. And I also have the load balancer with an external IP. So let's go and see if our application is running. So I'm going to copy the external IP right from here and go into my Edge browser and see if that works. And there you go. The application is modernized and is running on AKS cluster. So the next thing you're probably wondering what to do now. The first concern you usually have is monitoring. How do you monitor your Windows application? And using the log monitor tool we announced at Ignite last year, I am able to get my IIS and event viewer logs right here in the portal under Container Insights. And from the same pane, I can look at all my IIS logs. So that's your modern logging. And I can look at the cluster health right from here, the CPU utilization and the memory utilization, all from a single glass pane. I can now also use all the benefits of AKS, for example, scaling up, upgrading the cluster, and all of them are available to me right here. So that's your modernized iBuySpy. It's very easy, and all the processes I went through are well documented. With that, I'll hand it back over to Taylor.
All right. So now we've got our application. We've taken that existing app. We've been able to containerize it, get the image into the container registry, and all the way out to an instance of the Azure Kubernetes service. We've also been able to see how we can start to take advantage of some of that modernization. We're using a modern logging pattern now. We're using a database as a service in order to take advantage of some of the cost savings and new backup and deployment technologies that are available to us, all within a few minutes. Now, of course, this is a simplified demo version, but really, I believe that a large amount of the applications that we think about and we see in enterprises can be done in a day or less, especially as you start to get used to these patterns. All right. So let's take the next step on this. So we've got our application. It's in an instance of the Azure Kubernetes service. Now, how do we actually go about even taking advantage of more modernization patterns to it? Right. So let's think about this app that we just used. Right. It's a .NET application based on IIS, simple web application. Now, because we're in the Kubernetes ecosystem, we can start to take advantage of all sorts of different Kubernetes tools as we go through the next set of modernization. So an example of that might be using an ingress controller. Now, what's an ingress controller? You can really think of it as just a router, a way to route traffic within the Kubernetes cluster. So now if you've got 2 apps, 3 apps, 5 apps within that same Kubernetes cluster, Nginx can help route the traffic between them. A really common reason to do this might be A/B testing. So I want to have 2 versions of the app up and running at the same time. Maybe I've made some tweaks to the configuration. Maybe it's a new version of it, and I want to see how it performs in production with a 10% load. You can do that with things like an Nginx ingress controller. And because it's all within the Kubernetes cluster, we can simply deploy that into the environment. And so we'll take an example of that in just a moment with a demo. We'll take this Nginx controller. We're going to deploy it through Helm into that instance of Azure Kubernetes service right in front of our application. And so with that, let me throw it back over to Muzz, and he's going to take us through how we do that. Muzz?
Okay, let's take a look at how we can further modernize the app. So to deploy the Nginx ingress controller, the first thing I'm going to do is to create a namespace. And a namespace in Kubernetes, just like any namespace, is just to define the scope and keep things clean. And I'm going to call it ingress basic. So I do that, and the namespace is created. The next thing is I'm going to use this Helm package manager that you probably have heard, which is basically just a package manager that can packages your deployments pretty well. And you have hundreds of applications packaged and available to you called charts out there. So what we're going to do first is go to the Helm repo and download those charts. Nginx controller is just one of those charts. So I'm going to run this command. And you can use this Helm to create a package for your own application like iBuySpy. OK, so once that repo is added, now I'm going to quickly go and install the Nginx controller using help. So right here, all I'm saying is specifying the name of the chart that I'm going to use and the repo. And if you see here, I'm using replica count as 2. As you can recall, iBuySpy is a critical app. So, and as Taylor mentioned, it's the router, it's the front end to your Kubernetes cluster. So you probably want to have some redundancy. The other thing to note, if you recall in iBuySpy, I used node selector as Windows because it was a Windows application. But Nginx Ingress controller is a Linux application. So I'm going to specify the node selector as Linux, and I'm going to run this. It should take a second or two to install the Nginx controller. And now it has installed. Let's go and quickly see what has it done. So if I go and see all the services created, if you look here, there are 2 services created for Ingress controller. One is the load balancer with the external IP, and one is the backend, which will have all the routes you're going to define on how Nginx controller can route to your different application. But now, if you go to this external IP, which is going to point us to the Nginx controller, you're going to get a 404 because we don't have a default app deploy for Nginx controller so it can route the traffic to it until we define all these different routes. And to do that, I'm going to quickly come back to the YAML file. And if you see here at the end, I'm just going to add this new section called Ingress with the default port as 80. So all the default traffic can start going to my iBuySpy. When somebody hits the Nginx controller, they're going to land to iBuySpy. And once I've done that, I'm going to go back here and I'm going to quickly apply this new YAML file. And there you go. Now we should have it deployed. So if I come here and take this external IP and go to my Edge browser, it should take me to my iBuySpy app using the Nginx Ingress controller. Well, isn't that neat? Now you have an Nginx Ingress controller running and routing the traffic for you. Now you can use it for A/B testing in all sort of different ways. And that's how easy it is to continue modernizing your app. With that, I'm going to hand it back to Taylor.
All right. So now we've taken an application all the way from just an existing IIS, ASP.NET Web application, all the way through deployment into Kubernetes, and all the way into really being modernized with some new Kubernetes ecosystem components, Helm and Nginx, and really there's a huge range of things you can start to take advantage of. So with that, let's talk a little bit about some of the support that we have for Windows containers in AKS. And so we kind of mentioned earlier, it's Windows Server 2019, which is our latest long-term supported channel of Windows Server. We have support for persistent storage using either disks or Azure files. We've got networking support with the Azure CNI. Moz talked about it earlier at the very beginning. We've got the support for container insights with our log tooling integrated, so you can start to pull all those logs together into one dashboard, be it a Linux container or a Windows container. We can start to pull those Nginx logs along with our IIS logs in some pretty unique and neat ways. We've got support for Azure Advisor on AKS, of course, Security Center on AKS, and of course, private clusters, which is a new feature we recently announced, and SLA-based clusters. Those are general features of AKS, and of course, Windows containers are included in that as well now. So a full range of things that you can take advantage of as you start to modernize your applications on Azure with the Kubernetes service. Now, a couple of best practices just to keep in mind. Certainly think about node capacities. It could be through operations like patching and updating, as well as things like an unexpected outage. Maybe a node crashes or an instance of your application hangs. So always think about how many replicas you're running and that availability. A good example of this would be making sure that you have enough Kubernetes master nodes, at least 3, and in some cases you might need 5, depending on the size of your cluster. Right? Same thing with the workload nodes. Always be thinking about how you can leverage CI/CD and continually improving it. So one of the things that we'll often do is when we do have an issue with a deployment, we'll go back and root cause that and do a post-mortem analysis on it not really to identify blame, but to really identify how can we improve the value and quality of our CI and CD testing, right? And avoid that mistake happening again. Always keep everything up to date. This includes your worker nodes. This includes the Kubernetes components, the container images themselves. Containers aren't going to get you out of jail in terms of keeping things up to date and secure. All software and all code has bugs from time to time, and ensuring that those are always kept up to date is super important. We publish new versions of the container images every Patch Tuesday, so that's the second Tuesday of every month, with a full upload or a full update of all of the security fixes that are included in all of the versions of Windows Server. Of course, make sure that things like RBAC policies are properly configured and that access to the cluster is reduced and limited to really those who need it, and where necessary, two-factor authentication or additional security precautions are enabled. Be very aware of scale limits. So a good example of this is the scale limits for the number of services per node on Windows. It's right about 250. So keep that in mind as you're doing deployments, and there are other scale limits to keep in mind as well. Of course, all these are documented, and we've got a link at the end here to the documentation so you can take a look at that. Another good note to just remember is that the ecosystem of Kubernetes components often assumes that it's running on a Linux node. Now that's starting to change as we're seeing more and more Windows components come in and multi-version, but often the components you're going to see today do presume Linux. Now, as we just showed with the Nginx example, that can be just fine, but it is something to be aware of. And so with that, I told you we had some resources coming up, and I've got a QR code and an AKA link at the bottom that has all these listed, so don't worry about having to screenshot or capture them all down. All of those are linked to it. But these include some of the roadmaps to what we're doing on the AKS side. So all of the work that we're doing on Azure Kubernetes Service around all features, including Windows Server, as well as the roadmap for the Kubernetes project. And I will tell you, your feedback into both of those really shapes the direction of the community work, the open source and Kubernetes project work, as well as what we do on Azure. We look at that regularly. We use those verbatims in our planning and prioritization process. So please do consider those a really valuable place to both see what's coming as well as get feedback on it. Links to both of our docs, both our Windows container docs as well as the Azure Kubernetes docs. And I've specifically linked to the Windows deployment docs for this particular session. A link to our tools, including the bridge tools, and as we add other tools, those will come in there. And a link to the Windows Admin Center. And as that tool, the containerization tooling becomes available later in a couple weeks here, that will be updated with a link to it. And then last but not least, our PM team's email address. Please feel free to take advantage of this. Send us emails. We'd love to have that discussion with you. And with that, I will take some more questions until we get to the old hook.
Cool. Thanks, Taylor. So we have time for I think only 2 more questions, and I'm gonna pick the most popular ones right now we're getting. So the first question is, any plans to get the Kubernetes running in Windows only, especially for on-premise environment, without the Linux node at all?
Sure, definitely. First, I'll just say, if you have a question that doesn't get answered, please do send us an email. We're happy to take those questions at any time. On the specific question, the broader community of Kubernetes is really aligned around the Linux masters and the Windows worker model. We're certainly open to feedback and changing that. I can say personally, I see some real value in doing that. But it's a broader community discussion. So that link to the roadmap, that would be a great place to give your feedback on why that's valuable and help us prioritize that work.
Cool. And the last question we can get to is around GMSA. Basically, the support plans for GMSA on AKS, and would it be possible to containerize a .NET Framework 3.0 app which requires Windows integrated authentication?
So yes, it is absolutely possible to containerize an app that requires Windows authentication. We have a number of customers doing that. And in fact, you can use group managed service accounts through the AKS engine project today on Azure. We are working to add support for group managed service accounts to AKS. That'll show up on the roadmap as we have a specific timeline around it. And we'd love your feedback on the specific details of how that's being implemented and the ways that we're going about it and making sure that that meets your needs. But it is absolutely coming.
Cool. I think that's all the time we had, Taylor.
Awesome. Thank you all for the great questions and being here for Build. I hope you have a great rest of the day. And again, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We'd love to talk to you about what you're doing with Windows containers.